She heard the library before she saw it. Or rather, she heard what happened to it. The crash was the kind of sound that stopped time. Not a small crash.
Oh, God.
Not the kind produced by one book slipping from a shelf or a single vase catching a careless elbow. This was the sound of an entire wall of bookshelves, floor to ceiling, 300 volumes, 7 years of careful organization, coming down simultaneously. Followed by absolute silence. And then, from somewhere in the middle of all that silence, a voice. A voice that had not spoken in 4 months and 3 days. A voice that the entire staff of Ashmore House had been told by 3 separate physicians might not speak again, not because of any physical injury, but because grief, when it reaches a certain depth, stops asking permission before it takes things.
Oh, God.
That voice said one word. What? Not a question. Not an exclamation. Just the word, stripped of everything except the raw, bewildered fact of it. Delivered into a room that was now completely covered in books, by a duke who was staring at the woman standing in the middle of the wreckage, her arms still extended from the motion that had produced it, her expression carrying the specific quality of someone who has just done something catastrophic and is watching it finish happening and cannot do anything about any of it. Cecily Munro looked at the Duke of Ashmore. The Duke of Ashmore looked at Cecily Munro. Then he looked at his library. Then he looked at her again. She said, "I am so deeply, completely, and unreservedly sorry." He said nothing. But he was looking at her. Actually looking at her, with both eyes focused on the same point for the first time in 4 months and 3 days. Which meant she had done something that 3 physicians, 2 brothers, 1 very determined mother, and the entire household staff of Ashmore House had failed to do. She had made him present. She had just destroyed his library to do it, but she had done it. Stay with me. Because what happened in that library, and what happened in the weeks after, while Cecily Munro helped put every single book back in its correct place, is a story about grief and stubbornness and the specific miracle of a woman who could not walk through a room without affecting its structural integrity. Welcome to Regent Hearts. Every story here is the kind that stays with you. Subscribe before we go any further. Hit the bell. Now let us go back to the beginning. Her name was Cecily Munro. 24 years old. 3rd daughter of Sir Edmund Munro, a man who had produced 5 children with the same cheerful inexhaustibility that he applied to everything else in his life and who had long since given up attempting to manage any of them individually, preferring instead the general approach of pointing them in useful directions and hoping for the best. Cecily was not his most graceful child. This was not a criticism. It was simply a fact that the Munro family had accepted with the specific equanimity of people who have watched the same person walk into the same doorframe enough times to understand that some qualities are constitutional rather than correctable. She was not clumsy exactly. Clumsy implied carelessness. Cecily was extremely careful. She thought about where she was putting her feet. She noticed obstacles. She made plans for navigating around them. The plan simply had a higher than average failure rate. Her governess had described her at age 12 as a young woman of tremendous intentions. Her eldest sister Clara had described her, more accurately, as a disaster that had not yet happened but was always about to. Her mother had simply taken to walking slightly ahead of her in any room containing valuable objects. What Cecily had, in compensation for her complicated relationship with physical space, was a mind of considerable precision. She noticed things. She remembered everything. She could read a room in 10 seconds and understand the emotional architecture of it in 20. She had opinions that she expressed with the specific directness of someone who had learned early that performance was exhausting and honesty was efficient. She had one close friend, Margot Ellery, sharp-tongued and loyal, who had been her companion since they were 8 years old and who had witnessed enough of Cecily's structural disasters to have developed what she described as a finely tuned sense of impending catastrophe. She had not been in love before Oliver Ashmore. She had barely met Oliver Ashmore. She had met his grief first. The position at Ashmore House had been arranged by her father through a connection she had not asked about and had long since given up trying to trace. The Duke required a household manager. Someone capable, organized, reliable. Someone who could manage the staff and the accounts and the correspondence that had been accumulating since the Duchess died 7 months ago. Her father had said, "It is a temporary position. 3 months. The household is in some difficulty and you are capable." Her mother had said, "Be careful of the Duke. He is not well." Her sister Clara had said, "Do not break anything." Cecily had said, "I will be perfectly fine." She had been perfectly fine for 11 days. The house was the kind of beautiful that happens when something has been loved for a long time by people who knew what they were doing. Not the performative beauty of estates that existed to impress. The specific beauty of a place that had been inhabited honestly, where rooms had purposes and objects had histories and the arrangement of things made sense not because a decorator had decided it but because a person had lived there and arranged things the way they made sense to her. Her. Eleanor Ashmore. The Duchess. Dead 7 months ago at 28 years old, of a fever that had moved too fast for any physician to stop, leaving behind a house that still contained every evidence of her presence and a husband who had not spoken in 4 months and 3 days. Cecily learned Eleanor through the house before she learned anything else. She learned her through the arrangement of the morning room, where every chair faced the garden window because Eleanor had believed that breakfast should involve as much light as possible. Through the kitchen garden, which had been planted according to a system that Cook described as completely mad and absolutely perfect in equal measure. Through the library especially, where every book had been organized not by author or by subject but by the specific emotion Eleanor had felt when she read them. Comfort along the south wall. Challenge along the north. Wonder along the east. Grief along the west. Nobody had told Cecily this system. She had figured it out on her 6th day, standing in the library cataloguing the collection, noticing that the arrangement made no conventional sense and then making herself sit with the books themselves until the logic revealed itself. It was not conventional logic. It was emotional logic. The logic of a person who understood that what a book did to you mattered more than when it was written or who wrote it. Cecily had stood in a library for a long time after she understood this. Then she had gone to find Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper who had managed Ashmore House for 22 years, and she had said, "Tell me about her. The real her." Mrs. Hartley had looked at her for a long moment. Then she had sat down and talked for 2 hours. Oliver Ashmore she met in pieces. Not directly. He did not come to dinner. He did not come to the morning room or the drawing room or any of the public spaces of the house. He was in his study or his chambers or the library, always the library in the evenings, she had been told, though she had not yet encountered him there. She had been carefully managing her schedule to avoid the library in the evenings as a result. The library was his. She had no intention of intruding. She encountered him in the evidence he left. The correspondence she managed told her he was methodical. The estate accounts she reviewed told her he was precise. The library, Eleanor's library, organized by feeling, told her he had been coming here every evening not to read but to sit among the things Eleanor had organized and be in the specific proximity of her system. He was a man who sat in his dead wife's organizational logic every evening because it was the closest he could get to her. Cecily understood this with the clear specific empathy of someone who had lost her grandmother at 14 and had sat in the woman's garden for an entire summer because the garden still knew things she was not ready to stop knowing. She felt protective of him before she had ever seen his face. Which was not useful. Which was a quality she filed under managing and moved forward. On the 11th day she went to the library at 6 in the evening because the catalogue she was completing required 3 books from the west wall and she had checked 3 times to confirm that the Duke did not typically arrive until 8 and she was confident she had sufficient time. She did not have sufficient time. The stool was fine when she put her weight on it. It was fine for the first book. It was fine for the second. On the third book, which required her to extend her reach slightly further than was perhaps advisable, the stool made a decision. She grabbed the nearest thing. The nearest thing was the top shelf of a floor-to-ceiling bookcase. The bookcase was not secured to the wall. The bookcase went. The adjacent bookcase, connected by a bracket that Mrs. Hartley would later describe as insufficient, went with it. The third bookcase, in the spirit of solidarity, followed. 300 volumes. 2 collapsed shelving units. One woman standing in the wreckage with her arms still extended and the specific expression of someone watching a consequence complete itself and being completely unable to intervene. And in the leather chair by the window, a man who had not spoken in 4 months and 3 days. Who said one word? What? She had expected anger. She had prepared for anger on the walk from the wreckage to the doorway, which she had taken slowly because the floor was entirely covered in books and slow was the only available speed. She had prepared a comprehensive apology. She had identified 3 separate sentences that acknowledged the full scale of what had happened and took complete responsibility for all of it. What she had not prepared for was him looking at her. Not with anger. Not with the cold assessment she had been warned about by the staff who described the Duke in his current state as a man who was present but not there, who looked through things rather than at them, whose eyes had the specific quality of someone who has removed themselves to a significant interior distance and left only the functional exterior running. He was looking at her. With both eyes. Focused. Direct. The way you look at something when it has arrived in your field of vision so suddenly and so completely that your interior retreat is simply not fast enough to maintain itself. He was younger than she had expected. 29, she knew from the household records, but grief had done something to his face that made the age ambiguous, not older exactly but more weighted, as though each month of the past 7 had added something that was not visible but was present. Dark hair. Dark eyes carrying the specific quality of people who have looked at something they cannot stop seeing. The jaw of someone who had been keeping things inside through physical effort. He was looking at her like she was a problem he had not been given sufficient information to categorize. She said, "Your Grace, I am so deeply, completely, and unreservedly sorry. I was cataloguing the west wall and the stool was unstable and I apologize for the stool, for the shelves, for the books, for the noise, for the intrusion, and for every volume that is now on the floor. I will put them all back. Every single one. In the correct order." He said nothing. She said, "I know where they go." Not the conventional order. Her order. The system by feeling. I worked it out on day 6. Something shifted in his face. Not much. A movement so small that if she had not been watching with the specific attention she gave to rooms and the people in them she would have missed it entirely. She said, "I am not going to pretend the shelves fell by themselves. They did not. I fell on them. I often have this effect on structural things. I apologize for your library. I will fix it." He looked at her for another long moment. Then he said, his voice rough with disuse, the specific roughness of a door that has not been opened in a long time, "You knew the system." Not a question. A statement. Offered like something he had not meant to say but which had come out before the interior distance could close around it. She said, "Yes." He said, "How?" She said, "I sat with the books until the logic revealed itself. It is emotional logic, not subject logic. Comfort south, challenge north, wonder east, grief west. The grief wall is the most full." His throat moved. He said, "She added to it every week." Cecily understood immediately that this was the most he had said to anyone in 4 months and 3 days. She also understood, with the precise instinct she had for emotional architecture, that the worst thing she could do right now was acknowledge that. She said, "Will you help me? I need to know which books go where. The catalogue I made is accurate for placement but I need to know if anything moved since I documented it. She may have been reorganizing before." He looked at the floor. At the 300 volumes spread across it. He said, "She was always reorganizing." Cecily sat down on the floor. Right there, in the middle of the wreckage, she sat down and picked up the nearest book and said, "Then we should start now. Before I forget what was where." He looked at her sitting on the floor of his library surrounded by his dead wife's books. He looked for a long time. Then, slowly, with the specific careful movements of someone relearning how to inhabit a physical space, he got up from his chair. He came and sat on the floor beside her. He picked up a book. He said, "This goes on the east wall." Wonder? She could not stop reading it. She said it made her feel like the world was larger than she had been told. Cecily placed it in the east pile. She said, "What is it about?" He said, "A woman who travels to places that should not exist and discovers they are more real than home." Cecily said, "I want to read that." He said, "Eleanor would have lent it to you." The past tense landed in the room with the specific weight of things that cannot be taken back. He looked at the book in Cecily's hands. His jaw moved. He said, very quietly, "She would have liked you. You sit on the floor without asking if it is appropriate." Cecily said, "I was raised in a house with 4 sisters. The floor is simply the lowest available surface." Something happened in his face. Not a smile, but the specific movement of muscles that had not moved in the direction of a smile for 4 months and 3 days, making an attempt that did not quite complete itself but was unmistakably heading that way. They sorted books for 2 hours. It became a routine without either of them deciding it would. Cecily came to the library at 6. She brought her catalogue and her notes, and she worked on restoring the organization while there was still light. At some point between 6 and 8, Oliver would appear in the doorway. He would look at the progress from the door for a moment. Then he would come in and sit in his chair or, increasingly, on the floor beside the section she was working on, and he would tell her where things went. Not because she asked, though she did ask when she needed to, but because he was discovering, she thought, that talking about Eleanor's system was a way of talking about Eleanor that did not require him to look directly at the grief. He could approach it sideways, through the books, through the logic she had built, through the specific memories that attached themselves to specific volumes. He told her about the book on the west wall with the broken spine. Eleanor had dropped it into a bath and left it on the windowsill to dry, and it had warped, and she had been furious with herself, and he had told her it was fine and she had said it was not fine. Broken things carried their damage visibly, and there was something important about that, and he had told her she was being overly philosophical about a wet book, and she had told him he was being insufficiently philosophical about everything. And they had argued about it for 40 minutes and then laughed about it for years afterward. He told her about the book on the east wall with the inscription in Latin that Eleanor had not been able to read but had refused to let him translate because she liked having a mystery. He told her about the collection along the north wall, the challenge books, that Eleanor had organized specifically for the books that had made her angry. She had believed, he said, that anger at a book was a sign of respect. It meant the book had said something real enough to push against. He told her these things the way people tell things they have been carrying alone for a long time and have found an unexpected place to put down. Cecily listened with the complete specific attention she gave to things that mattered. She did not perform sympathy. She did not offer the careful managed responses of someone navigating grief on behalf of another person. She simply listened, and occasionally said things like, "She sounds like someone who had decided to inhabit her opinions completely," or, "I would also have refused the translation. The mystery is better." On the 6th evening he said, "You are very easy to talk to." She said, "I have been told I am not, actually. My sister Clara says I am direct to the point of startling." He said, "Directness is easy to talk to. It is performance that is exhausting." She looked at him from her position on the floor with a stack of wonder category books in her arms. She said, "You have been performing for 4 months. He said, "I have been trying not to perform. The result has been silence." She said, "Silence is its own performance sometimes. The performance of a man who is managing his grief in a way that requires no one to engage with it directly." The room was very still. He said, "That is an uncomfortable observation." She said, "Yes. I apologize. I do that." He said, "Do not apologize." She did the same thing. He meant Eleanor. Cecily knew he meant Eleanor. She placed the books in the east pile. She said, "What would she say to you right now? If she could." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She would say I was being impossible and that grief was not an excuse to stop being a person." Cecily said, "She sounds correct." He said, "She usually was." She said, "That must have been annoying." He said, "Constantly." The smile came. Small. Incomplete. The specific smile of muscles relearning a direction they had not traveled in a long time. but real. Cecily looked at her books and said nothing and let him have the moment without commenting on it, because commenting on it would have made it self-conscious and self-conscious would have closed it back down. She added it to the list she was keeping. Not a written list. The interior one. The one she kept about Oliver Ashmore, which was growing in ways she had not planned for and was beginning to require management. She had not planned to notice the way he moved. The careful specific economy of a man who had been managing physical space around his grief for 7 months, moving through rooms without touching things that were hers, sitting in chairs positioned at angles that acknowledged her absence without making it the center of the room. She had not planned to find this particular quality of attention moving. She had not planned to think about him during the hours she was not in the library. She was doing household accounts in the morning room one afternoon and found herself 3 pages into the ledger before she realized she had not actually processed any of them because she had been thinking about something he had said the previous evening about the North Wall books and whether anger at a text was respect or argument. She had not planned any of this. She was also precise enough to be honest about what it was. She told Margot in a letter, because Margot was in London and letters were the only available method, and Cecily had learned through painful experience that keeping this kind of information inside without external processing produced errors in judgment. She wrote, "I have developed feelings I did not anticipate for a man who is still in love with his dead wife and who is my employer for another 6 weeks. I am managing this information carefully. I am not acting on it. I am simply telling you because you are the person I tell things to and also because you will hear about it eventually and I would prefer you hear it from me first." Margot wrote back in 2 days, "How bad?" Cecily wrote back, "Considerably." Margot wrote, "Does he know?" Cecily wrote, "Absolutely not. He is grieving. I am managing the household. These are the relevant facts." Margot wrote, "Cecily." Cecily wrote, "I know." Margot wrote, "What are you going to do?" Cecily wrote, "Finish the catalogue, restore the library, complete my 3 months, and leave." Margot wrote, "And if he asks you to stay?" Cecily did not write back for 4 days because she was not sure how to answer that and she did not believe in answering things she was not sure about. It was raining. Not dramatically. The specific patient rain of late autumn that settles in for the evening and makes every interior space feel more interior. They had been in the library for 2 hours. The restoration was nearly complete. 3 shelves remained, the entire west wall, the grief books, the section she had been saving for last because Oliver had been approaching it slowly over the previous weeks and she had understood without being told that it required approach rather than arrival. He was holding a book she had not seen him hold before. Small, leather-bound, worn in a way that suggested repeated handling. He was not looking at it. He was looking at the west wall. She said, "Is that one for the west wall?" He said, "No. This one does not have a wall." She waited. He said, "She was reading it when she got sick. It was on the table beside her bed for 4 months. I have not been able to put it anywhere because every place feels wrong." Cecily set down the books she was holding. She said, "What would she have put it?" He said, "I do not know. She never told me. I have been trying to figure out for 7 months where it belongs and I cannot." His voice was steady. She had learned his voice over 5 weeks and she knew that the steadiness was effortful. That underneath it something was pressing against the walls he maintained. She said, "May I look at it?" He handed it to her. She opened it. It was a book of poetry. She read the first poem. Then the second. Then, understanding the collection, she looked at the west wall. She said, "It belongs here. But not in the grief section specifically. Look, the west wall has 2 sections. The grief she was reading into, the grief she was reading through. This," she held up the book, "is the grief she was reading through. She was not reading this to sit inside sadness. She was reading it to move through it." He stared at her. She said, "Grief toward something. Not grief as a destination." She was using this book the way you use a road. He crossed the room. He took the book from her. He looked at it for a long time. Then he placed it on the west wall. Not in the heavy center of the section but at the far right edge. Where the wall ended and the east wall began. Where grief met wonder. His hand stayed on the spine. He said, very quietly, she would have known exactly where it went. She always knew. Cecily said, she left you the system so you could figure it out without her. The silence that followed was the specific silence of something being understood for the first time. He turned. He was close. Closer than usual. The library was small and they had been working in it for 5 weeks and she had long since stopped noticing the proximity except she was noticing it now. He said, why did you come here? To Ashmore House. What did you actually come here for? She said, to manage the household. He said, you have done considerably more than that. She said, I knocked down your library. He said, yes. And then you sat on the floor and started sorting books and you figured out Eleanor's system and you made me talk for the first time in 4 months and you have been coming here every evening for 5 weeks and I have been telling you things I have not told anyone and I would like to understand why that is. Her hands were very still. She said, I think you told me things because I listened without managing your grief for you. I did not try to reduce it or resolve it or make it more comfortable. I just let it be the size it actually was. He said, that is part of it. She said, what is the rest? He looked at her with the full specific attention she had seen building over 5 weeks. Not the attention of grief. Not the attention of someone looking through a person rather than at them. The attention of someone who has become aware of another person with the specific clarity that arrives without warning and without permission and will not be filed away. He said, I think you know what the rest is. The rain pressed against the windows. The library held its breath. She said, Oliver. His name. Just that. The specific weight of using it for the first time. He said, I know. I know it is too soon and I know what it looks like and I know that what I felt for Eleanor was real and is still real and will always be real. I am not replacing it. I am not diminishing it. She said, I know you are not. He said, I am telling you that something is happening that I did not plan for and that I am not certain what to do with. And I would rather tell you directly than pretend I do not notice and have you leave in 3 weeks without having said it. She looked at him. She said, I have been keeping a list. He said, a list. She said, evidence. The way you sat on the floor without asking if it was appropriate. The way you placed the book at the edge where grief meets wonder because that is where Eleanor was going. The way you said she would have liked you without flinching at the past tense. He said, that is what you put on a list about a person. She said, I put on a list what seems true about them. That is how I understand things. He said, and what does the list say? She said, it says you are a man who loved someone completely and is learning very slowly how to be in the world without her. And that the learning has produced something in you that was not there before. Something that is not the person you were before the grief but is more honest than that person. More present. He was very still. She said, the list also says I am in significant trouble and have been for several weeks and that my original plan of finishing the catalogue and leaving quietly was a good plan and I am not sure it is still available. He reached out. He took her hand. Not dramatically. With the specific care of a man who has learned what it costs to hold something and is choosing to hold it anyway. He said, stay. She said, I am not Eleanor. He said, I know exactly who you are. You are the woman who knocked down my entire library and sat in the wreckage and sorted books for 5 weeks. You are the woman who figured out the system and told me grief was not a destination. You are the woman who made a list. She said, that is not a recommendation. He said, it is the most accurate description of a person I have ever heard. She looked at him. She said, the position ends in 3 weeks. He said, I know. She said, what happens after the position? He said, whatever you want to happen. I am not asking you to replace anything or become anything or fit into a shape that already exists. I am asking you to stay because the evenings are better when you are here and the library is nearly finished and I would like to find out what comes after the library. She said, "You are aware that I will continue to affect the structural integrity of this house." He said, "Eleanor used to rearrange the furniture when she was restless. I have been navigating around moved chairs for 7 years. I expect I can manage." She said, "That is not the same." He said, "No. But I have been sitting with the same books in the same arrangement for 7 months and nothing has changed. You knocked them all onto the floor and everything changed." She looked at him. She looked at their joined hands. She said, "The catalogue is not finished." He said, "I know." She said, "I should finish it." He said, "Yes." She said, "And then we will see." He said, "Yes." She said, "I want to read the book about the woman who travels to places that should not exist." He said, "I will leave it on the east wall for you." She said, "Wonder." He said, "Yes." She squeezed his hand once and let it go and picked up the book she had set down and went back to work. He went back to his chair. The rain continued. The west wall was nearly complete. Mrs. Hartley noticed first. Not because anything dramatic had occurred. Because she was a woman who had managed a household for 22 years and understood that houses had their own intelligence, assembled from the accumulated evidence of the people who lived in them. The Duke was eating breakfast. Not in his chambers. In the breakfast room. At the table. With the newspaper and coffee and the specific unhurried quality of someone who has somewhere to be but is not dreading it. Mrs. Hartley stood in the doorway for a moment and watched. Then she went to find Cook and said, very quietly, "He is eating breakfast." Cook said, "In the breakfast room?" Mrs. Hartley said, "In the breakfast room." Cook said, "I'll make something warm for Miss Monroe." Mrs. Hartley said, "Yes." Neither of them said anything else. They did not need to. The library was finished on a Thursday. Cecily stood in the center of it and looked at the 3 walls restored to their positions, the books returned to their places, the system intact. She had been careful. Every book was where Eleanor had placed it. Every category was respected. She had found 2 books during the restoration process that she had not initially been able to categorize and had ultimately understood, one for the challenge wall, one for the wonder wall, and she had placed them with the specific care of someone who understood she was working inside another person's architecture. Oliver was behind her. He had been watching her work for the past hour. She said, "It is done." He said, "Yes." She said, "I did not disturb the system. Everything is where she put it." He said, "I know. I watched." She turned. She said, "What do you want to do with it now?" "The library. Now that it is restored." He said, "Use it." Eleanor organized it to be used, not preserved. She would be appalled if it became a monument. Cecily said, "Then we should use it." He said, "Yes." She said, "I want to start with the east wall." He said, "Wonder." She said, "Yes." He took the book about the woman who traveled to places that should not exist from the east wall and held it out to her. She took it. Their hands were close. He said, "I should like to talk about it when you have read it. Eleanor and I used to do that. She would read something and come to find me and argue about it for an hour. She said, I am constitutionally incapable of reading something important without discussing it afterward. He said, I know. She said, how do you know? He said, because I have been watching you work in this library for 5 weeks, and every time you encounter something in the catalogue that interests you, you stop cataloguing for 3 minutes and read 4 pages and then put it back with a specific expression. She said, I was not aware you were watching. He said, you were very focused on the books. She said, that is not an excuse. He said, no. But it was an accurate description of events. She looked at him. He was smiling. Not the incomplete almost smile of the previous weeks. A real one. The specific smile of a man who has found his way back to the surface of his own face. She said, that is the first real smile. He said, I know. She said, Eleanor would be glad. He said, yes. She would be very smug about it, actually. She always believed I was too serious. Cecily said she was right. He said she usually was. She said that must have been annoying. He said constantly. They stood in the finished library with its 300 restored books and its emotional logic and its grief wall with a small book at the edge where grief met wonder. He said, stay for dinner. She said, I live here. He said, stay for dinner in the dining room. With me. At the same end of the table. She said, not opposite ends. He said, never opposite ends again. She said, that is a significant architectural change. He said, I know. I am ready for it. She looked at the book in her hands. At the east wall behind her. She said, yes. He wrote to his mother on a Saturday. Not about Cecily. Not directly. He wrote the kind of letter that says something by saying something adjacent to it. He wrote that he had been sleeping better. That the library was restored. That he had been eating breakfast in the breakfast room. That the household was being managed with unusual competence. His mother wrote back in 4 days. She said, the household manager. Tell me about her. He wrote back, she knocked down the entire library on her 11th day and then sat in the wreckage and started sorting books. His mother wrote back, that is the most information you have ever conveyed about a person in a single sentence. When can I meet her? He showed Cecily the letter at dinner. She read it. Then she looked at him. She said, you told her I knocked down the library. He said, it seemed like the accurate place to begin. She said, I am going to meet your mother. He said, yes. She said, she is going to ask me about the library. He said, she is going to ask you about everything. She is extremely thorough. She said, is that where you get it? He said, yes. She said, I can manage thorough. He said, I know. She said, Oliver. He said, yes. She said, I have been thinking about what you said. About finding out what comes after the library. He said, yes. She said, I would like to find out. He looked at her across the end of the dinner table where the candles burned and the chairs were no longer at opposite ends. He said, I should tell you something first. Not as a condition. As information. Because you are a person who makes lists and I want you to have accurate information for the list. She said, tell me. He said, I loved Eleanor. I will always love her. She is in this house and in that library and in a great deal of who I am. That does not diminish. That does not change. But I have understood something over the past 5 weeks that I did not understand before. She said, what? He said, she used to say that grief toward something was different from grief as a destination. That you could carry it with you in the direction of living rather than making it the place where you stopped. She said, the book at the edge of the west wall. He said, yes. She knew it before I did. She left it in the system for me to find. And I found it because you knocked down the library. Cecily was very still. He said, I am not asking you to be anything except what you are. I am telling you that what you are is someone I would like to have in my life permanently, if you are willing. She said, that is not a proposal. He said, not yet. It is an intention. Declared honestly, with full information, with the understanding that you are free to have whatever response to it you actually have rather than the response you think is appropriate. She said, my response is that I have been keeping a list and the list is full and I would like to find out what comes after the library too. He said, yes. She said, but I want to say something first also. He said, tell me. She said, I came here to manage a household for 3 months. I fell onto your shelves on day 11. I sat on your floor and sorted books and I listened to you talk about Eleanor and I understood from the first week that she was a person of considerable quality and that the house was full of her and that you were full of her. He said, Cecily. She said, I am not finished. I want to say that I have not been trying to take her place. I have not been trying to become anything she was. What I have been doing is being precisely myself in proximity to you and finding that precisely myself is apparently something you respond to. And that has been entirely unexpected. He said, yes. It has. She said, I also knocked down your library. He said, yes. She said, and you spoke for the first time in 4 months. He said, yes. She said, because of the crash. He said, because of you. The crash was incidental. She looked at him. He looked at her. She said, this is going to be a complicated story to tell people. He said, she knocked down my library and sat in the wreckage and put it all back in the right order. He paused. That is not a complicated story. That is the only story worth telling. She said, your mother is going to love that. He said, she is going to be insufferable about it. She said, good. I like insufferable mothers. He said, you have not met her yet. She said, I am optimistic. He said, Cecily. She said, yes. He reached across the end of the table. He took her hand. He said, thank you for sitting on the floor. She said, thank you for speaking. The candles burned. The library held its 300 volumes in their correct emotional positions. And at the edge of the west wall, in the place where grief met wonder, a small worn book leaned slightly toward the east. Spring arrived the way it always did. Without asking. Cecily was in the library. This was not unusual. She was in the library most mornings now, not cataloguing, that had been done and redone and was complete to a standard that Mrs. Hartley described as frankly unnecessary and which Oliver described as exactly right, but reading. Working through the east wall systematically, the way she did everything, with the specific focused pleasure of someone who had been given access to a collection organized by a person of excellent taste and intended to use all of it. Oliver was in his chair. Also not unusual. He was reading the correspondence from the estate solicitors with the focused expression of a man who found legal documents genuinely interesting, which Cecily had identified as one of his more unusual qualities and had filed under the list, which was now several pages long and which she had transferred from her interior version to an actual notebook because the interior version had run out of space. She said, without looking up, your mother wrote again. He said, I know. I saw the letter. She said, she wants us to come to London for the season. He said, yes. She said, she also enclosed a list of social engagements she has already confirmed on our behalf. He said, she does that. She said, Oliver. He said, yes. She said, she has confirmed 17 engagements. He said, she is enthusiastic. She said, she is extraordinary. He said, she is insufferable. Cecily said, I told you I would like her. He said, I told you she would be insufferable. She said, both things are true. He stood up. He crossed the library. He did not stop at the chair or the catalogue table. He came to where she was sitting on the floor with her book and he sat down beside her, which was where he had been sitting for 6 months, on the floor of the library, because Cecily sat on floors and floors were simply the lowest available surface. He said, I have been thinking about something. She said, tell me. He said, I wrote to Eleanor's family last week. Her sister. Cecily looked up. He said, I wanted to tell her that the library is intact. That the system is intact. That I understand the system now. All of it. Including the book at the edge. She said, what did her sister say? He reached into his coat. He produced a letter. He handed it to her. She read it. The letter said, Eleanor used to write to me about you. She said you were the most stubborn man she had ever loved and that you would need someone equally stubborn to reach you after she was gone. She said she hoped you would find that person. I am glad you did. Give the library my love. Cecily held the letter for a long time. Oliver said, I want you to know that. She said, I know. He said, she would have loved you. I said it in November and I mean it more now. She said, the floor. He said, yes. And the list. And the thing you do with books when you find a passage that matters, you stop and you press your hand against the page as if you are trying to feel the words through the paper. She said, I do that. He said, Eleanor did too. She was quiet. He said, I am not saying that because you are like her. You are not like her. You are entirely yourself, and that is the thing. That is the specific thing. She said, Oliver. He said, yes. She said, I am going to knock something over in a moment. He said, why? She said, because I am going to stand up and I am currently sitting on the floor surrounded by books and there is a stool directly behind me and my record with stools is not good. He said, stand up toward me. Not toward the stool. She stood up toward him. She did not knock anything over. They stood in the library among the wonder books and the challenge books and the comfort books and the grief books and the small worn volume at the edge where grief met wonder. He said, I have a question. Not an intention this time. An actual question. She said, ask it. He said, will you marry me? Not because the household requires a duchess. Not because of anything except that I would like to spend the rest of my life finding out what happens next in a room with you in it. She said, you are aware that rooms with me in them are structurally at risk. He said, I am aware. She said, your library has already been compromised once. He said, and completely restored. She said, this house will never be safe. He said, I know. I find I do not care about safe anymore. She looked at him. She said, yes. He kissed her. Not carefully. With the specific unhesitating certainty of a man who has spent 6 months on the floor of his own library becoming certain of something and has arrived at the destination. From the doorway, Mrs. Hartley turned and walked back to the kitchen without saying a word. She found Cook and said, send for the good champagne. Cook said, the French? Mrs. Hartley said, the French. Cook said nothing for a moment. Then, she did knock down the entire library. Mrs. Hartley said, and put it all back in the right order. They stood in the kitchen of Ashmore House while Spring moved through the gardens outside. Cook said, Eleanor would have loved her. Mrs. Hartley said, yes. She would have been completely insufferable about it. They did not say anything else. They did not need to. Before you go. Oliver Ashmore had not spoken in 4 months. Not because he could not. Because grief had made speaking feel like a betrayal of the weight of what he was carrying. Because silence was the only container large enough. And a woman knocked down his library by accident and sat in the wreckage and started sorting books and said nothing about his silence at all. She did not try to fix him. She did not manage his grief. She just sat on the floor and treated him like a person who was present. A woman on the floor in the wreckage, sorting books, asking where things go. Subscribe to Regent Hearts. Share this with someone today. Tell me which moment stayed with you. The crash. The first word. The floor. The book at the edge where grief met wonder. Or the question asked toward her, not toward the stool.